There's a particular silence that fills a boardroom when 12 people are waiting to see if you'll cry. I felt it settle over the 42nd floor of Aldermont Ventures the morning Sebastian Voss reassigned my entire portfolio with a single email, and then asked me, in front of the whole investment committee, whether I'd thought about what comes next for me. I hadn't cried in that room in 9 years. I wasn't about to start. What Sebastian didn't know, what none of them had bothered to check, was that the fund he'd just taken control of couldn't move a dollar above a certain line without one signature. Mine. He was about to wire $214 million, and I was about to open page 31. The first thing I did every morning was check the wire queue before I checked my own reflection. Not out of vanity in reverse, out of habit. For 11 years at Aldermont Ventures, the capital that moved through our fund moved past my desk first, and I had learned that a number on a screen tells you more about a company's health than any pitch deck ever will. By 6:40, I was usually the second person on the 42nd floor. The cleaning crew was first. Everyone else came later and louder. That morning, the city was still gray below the floor-to-ceiling glass, the harbor a flat sheet of pewter, the skyline just starting to catch light. I set my coffee on the corner of the long obsidian table in the main committee room. We called it the Vault, half as a joke about how much it had cost to build, and I opened the deployment log. There was a deal in motion. A $214 million growth round into Corvea Systems, a logistics orchestration platform out of the Baltic corridor that I had personally sourced, diligenced, and championed for 14 months. It was the largest single check Aldermont had ever written. It was mine. Or it had been. Let me tell you who I am, because the rest of this only makes sense if you understand what I built here. My name is Sasha Marchand. I'm managing partner and chair of the investment committee at Aldermont Ventures, a $4 billion fund that backs infrastructure software companies most people will never hear of and use every single day. I joined as a principal when the fund was a third of its current size and run out of a leased half floor with a broken espresso machine. I sat on the committee that approved our first billion-dollar fund. I wrote the risk framework that the limited partners still quote back to us in their annual letters. When a founder in our portfolio got a 3 a.m. call that their lead investor was pulling out of a syndicate, the second call they made was to me. I was not decorative. I want that on the record, because decorative is the word that was about to be used. The reason there even was a Corvea deal was a dinner I'd taken 18 months earlier in a half-empty hotel restaurant, listening to a soft-spoken founder named Thomas Rinna explain how he'd rebuilt his entire dispatch architecture after a competitor tried to buy and bury him. Everyone else who'd looked at Corvea saw a regional player with thin margins. I saw a company that had quietly become the connective tissue under 4 national freight networks, with switching costs so high that losing them would strand a continent's worth of cargo. I flew out 3 times. I read their code audits. I modeled the downside until I could recite it in my sleep. By the time I brought it to committee, the term sheet was clean and the conviction was total. We were 48 hours from the wire, and then the LPs sent us Sebastian. He arrived the way weather arrives, announced in advance, underestimated, then suddenly the only thing anyone could talk about. The limited partners had decided, in their wisdom, that Aldermont needed modernization. Newer thesis, faster cycles, a general partner with a public profile and a podcast. Sebastian Voss had all 3. He'd run a smaller fund into a single spectacular exit, written a book about it, and developed the particular confidence of a man who had been right once at scale and concluded he could not be wrong. He took the corner office that had been empty since our founder semi-retired. He took the parking spot, and on his 9th day, he took my portfolio. I found out the way everyone found out, by email, sent to the full distribution list at 8:14 in the morning, subject line, portfolio realignment, effective immediately. I read it standing at the glass, coffee going cold in my hand. In the interest of streamlining decision velocity, it said, the following portfolios will be consolidated under the GP office. My name appeared once, in a table, in a row that moved Corvea Systems, my deal, the one I'd bled 14 months into, out of my column and into his. There was no call, no meeting, no let's discuss. Just a table. I'd been in this business long enough to know that the cruelty of corporate life is rarely loud. It's administrative. It happens in spreadsheets and reorg charts and the passive voice. The following portfolios will be consolidated. By whom? By the structure. It's nobody's fault, you see. It's just efficiency. I set the coffee down very carefully so I would not throw it. By 9, the committee had gathered in the vault for what was billed as a transition sink. 12 of us around the obsidian table, partners, principals, 2 of our investor relations leads, the general counsel, Priyanka, dialing in from a window on the far screen. Sebastian stood at the head of the table where our founder used to sit, sleeves rolled, tablet in hand, radiating the easy warmth of a man who has never once had to wonder whether the room was on his side. "Sasha," he said, and smiled like we were old friends. "I want to start by thanking you. 11 years. That's a real legacy." He let that hang. Legacy is a word people use about things that are over. We're entering a new chapter, and I think the smartest thing I can do is let the people closest to a thesis own it end to end. Corvea's a beautiful deal. I'm going to carry it home. I said nothing. I'd learned over 11 years that the most powerful thing in a room full of people braced for a reaction is to not give them one. "I know change is hard," he went on, gentler now, the way you'd talk to someone being walked out. "And I want you to know your title isn't going anywhere. Chair of the committee, that stays. It's just..." He searched for the word, found it, deployed it. "It's more of a stewardship role now. Honorary, in the best sense. You've earned the right to slow down. Honorary. Stewardship. Decorative. He didn't quite say, but the room heard it anyway. Across the table, a younger principal named Dev let out the smallest exhale of a laugh and then caught himself. 2 others studied the grain of the table. Our general counsel, a careful woman named Adaiz, looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Not pity, exactly. Something closer to a question. I held Sebastian's gaze and let 3 full seconds pass. "Congratulations on the deal," I said. "It's a good one." He blinked just slightly. He'd expected an argument. People always do when they hand you a knife and ask you to use it on yourself. "I'm glad you see it that way," he said, recovering. "We'll wire Thursday." I picked up my cold coffee and stood. "Thursday," I agreed. What Sebastian had done, what the LPs had done, what the email had done, was reassign a portfolio. They believed that was the same as reassigning power. They were about to learn those are not the same thing at all, and that the difference between them was sitting in a document none of them had opened in years. Because the Corvea wire was $214 million. And there was a clause in the Aldermont Limited Partnership Agreement, negotiated a long time ago by a much younger version of me, about exactly what had to happen before this fund could move a number that large. I went back to my office, closed the door, and pulled up a file I hadn't needed to look at in 6 years. By Tuesday, Sebastian had stopped pretending I was a colleague and started treating me like a piece of furniture he intended to donate. It happened in increments, the way these things do. My name came off the Corvea data room. My standing invite to the Thursday deal sync vanished from my calendar with a polite gray "declined." A junior analyst I'd hired myself 2 years earlier, a sharp kid named Olin, stopped making eye contact in the kitchen. Not because he'd turned on me, because he'd done the math everyone in a building like this learns to do early. Proximity to the falling is contagious. So you keep your distance, and you hate yourself a little for it, and you tell yourself it's just survival. I didn't blame him. Staying quiet in a room where the loud man controls your bonus isn't cowardice. It's arithmetic. I'd done the same math at his age. The difference was that I'd also spent 11 years making sure that when the math finally cut against me, I'd have already changed the equation. The real escalation came Wednesday at the all-partners lunch. We held them in the glass-walled room on 43, the one with the view of the bridge, and they were usually a low-stakes affair, quarterly numbers, a few war stories, someone's overcooked talking points about market timing. This one was different. Sebastian had turned it into a coronation. He stood at the front with a single slide projected behind him. Corvea, closing Thursday, $214 million. The number sat there in clean white type like a trophy he'd hunted himself. This, he said, sweeping a hand at it, is what decisiveness looks like. He talked for 11 minutes. He talked about velocity and conviction and how the fund had grown comfortable under prior leadership. He didn't say my name, which was somehow worse than if he had. He described a culture of deliberation as a substitute for courage, and around the table I watched people nod, not because they believed it, but because nodding was free and disagreeing was not. Then he found me at the end of the table, and he smiled, and he made it personal. Sasha sourced this one, and credit where it's due, he said. She did the early legwork. But there's a difference between finding a deal and closing one. Finding is research. Closing is leadership. He let the room absorb that. Some people are scouts. Some people are killers. The fund needs killers. Dev laughed again, louder this time, emboldened because the boss had made laughing safe. A couple of others joined. Not cruelty, exactly. Relief. The relief of a room that has identified who's drowning and is grateful it isn't them. I felt the heat climb the back of my neck, and I let it. Then I let it pass. I want to be honest about that moment, because the version where I felt nothing is a lie people tell to sound strong. I felt all of it. 11 years. 3 flights to the Baltic. 14 months of conviction. A founder who trusted me, specifically me, with the company he'd nearly lost. And here was a man on his 12th day calling me a scout in front of the people I'd hired. What kept my face still was a single, cold, clarifying fact. He had just announced, to a room of 12 witnesses, that he intended to wire $214 million on Thursday, and he had never once asked who was required to authorize it. "You're right," I said, and the room turned, surprised I'd spoken at all. "Closing is leadership. I look forward to watching how Thursday goes." It landed wrong for him. I saw it. He'd wanted submission or a fight, and I'd given him neither. Just a sentence that sounded like agreement and felt, to anyone paying attention, like a door clicking shut somewhere out of sight. He covered it with a grin and moved on to the bridge view and the dessert order. But Adaisy, our general counsel, looked at me down the length of the table, and this time I could read her expression perfectly. She'd remembered something. After lunch, she caught me by the elevators, lowered her voice under the hum of the floor. "Sasha," she said, "the LPA, the deployment threshold." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Adaise had been at Aldermont almost as long as I had. She'd been a second-year associate when we papered the fund's governing documents, and she'd been in the room, quiet, taking notes, the week I made my one non-negotiable demand. "Section 7.4, I said. "Does he know?" "Nobody told him to read it," She was quiet for a moment. The elevator chimed and neither of us got on. "You could tell him now," she said carefully. Quietly, "Give him the chance to bring you back in. He'd have to." "He would," I agreed. "But you're not going to." I thought about the slide. Some people are scouts. Some people are killers. I thought about 11 years of being the one who read the documents nobody else wanted to understand, the one whose name sat on the protections everyone forgot existed until the day they saved the firm. "He's about to wire $214 million he isn't authorized to send," I said. "I'm not going to stop him from learning that the hard way." Adese exhaled slowly. It wasn't approval. It wasn't disapproval. It was the look of a lawyer watching a clause she'd drafted years ago quietly stand up and walk toward the center of the room. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," I said. That night I stayed late, long after the floor had emptied and the city had switched over to its electric self below the glass. I opened the Aldermont Limited Partnership Agreement on my screen, 211 pages, executed years ago, signed by every partner and every limited partner and notarized in triplicate. I scrolled past the boilerplate, past the management fee waterfalls, past the indemnification language, until I reached page 31. And there it was, section 7.4. The clause a younger, warier version of me had insisted on in the only negotiation I have ever refused to lose. I read it once, slowly, the way you'd read your own name carved somewhere you didn't expect to find it. Then I made one phone call. Let me stop here for a second, because this is the exact moment I have to ask you something. When Sebastian stood in front of that room and called me a scout instead of a killer, would you have corrected him right then? Or would you have done what I did and let him walk all the way to the edge before he found out the ground wasn't there? Tell me in the comments, correct him or let him fall. I read every answer, and I'm genuinely curious which kind of person you are. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who never bothered to read the fine print, you'll want to stay for what page 31 actually said. Subscribe so you don't lose the rest of this. The call I made that night was to a man named Henrik Aldous, and he answered on the second ring, even though it was nearly 11. "Sasha Marchand," he said, with the dry warmth of someone who has known you long enough to skip the pleasantries. "It's late for a social call, which means it isn't one." Henrik was the fund's outside counsel, not the in-house team, but the firm that had actually drafted the Aldermont LPA more than a decade ago. He'd been a senior associate then. He was a name partner now, and he was, as far as I knew, one of perhaps 4 living people who genuinely understood every line of the document the fund was built on, because he'd written half of them. "I need you to confirm something for me," I said. Section 7.4, the deployment authorization threshold. There was a pause, and then a soft sound that might have been a laugh. "Ah," he said. "Somebody's about to write a very large check. $214 million, Thursday. And they haven't called me." "They haven't called anyone," I said. "They reassigned the deal to a new GP who's been here 12 days. He thinks the wire is a formality." Henrik was quiet for a moment, and I could hear him moving, the rustle of a man pulling a binder off a shelf in a home office at 11 at night, because some things you want to read with your own eyes. "Let me make sure I'm remembering my own handiwork correctly," he said. "Read me the heading." I read it. Section 7.4, Major Deployment Consent. Keep going. "No single deployment of committed capital in excess of $150 million shall be authorized, initiated, or executed absent the express written consent of the chair of the investment committee. whose consent right under this section is personal to the office of the chair and may not be delegated, assigned, or overridden by the general partner, the managing member, or any successor governance body, save by unanimous written resolution of all limited partners. I stopped. The room was very quiet. Below me, the city went on not knowing. "You wrote that?" I said. "You insisted on it," Henrik corrected. "I remember the meeting. Everyone wanted to give the GP unilateral authority on big checks, speed, optionality, all the usual. You were a principal. You weren't even chair yet. And you said you wouldn't sign unless there was a single human signature standing between this fund and a catastrophic mistake on a number that large." He paused. "You said, and I've quoted you for years, velocity is how funds die. I want one person who can pull the brake." So we made the brake personal to the chair. Not the GP, not the board. The chair. I let myself sit with that. The younger version of me, 28 days into a job she was terrified of losing, refusing to sign a document until it protected the fund from the exact kind of confidence that was now sitting in the corner office. "And I'm still chair," I said. "You are expressly still chair," Henrik said. "I saw the reorg memo. It crossed our desk this morning. It moved a portfolio. It did not, and structurally could not, remove you from the chairmanship without a unanimous LP resolution. Reassigning a deal doesn't touch 7-4. The consent right doesn't follow the portfolio. It follows the office, and you hold the office." There it was. The whole shape of it, clean and total. Sebastian had taken Corvea from my column. He had taken my standing invite, my data room access, my dignity at a partner's lunch. He had taken everything he could see. But the one thing that actually mattered, the single signature required to move $214 million, was attached to a title he'd been careful to leave me because he thought it was decorative. He'd let me keep the brake because he didn't know it was a brake. He thought it was a nameplate. "What happens Thursday if I don't consent?" I asked, "and he tries to wire anyway?" Henrik's voice turned crisp, the way lawyers' voices do when they stop reminiscing and start advising. "Then the wire is a breach of the operating agreement. Our custodian bank has the LPA covenants on file. Every major funds does. And the authorization protocol for deployments above the threshold requires the chair's counter-signature to release. Practically, the bank won't move it. The instruction will hit the compliance desk. The desk will check the deployment ledger for the required consent. It won't be there, and the wire will sit, frozen, pending authorization that only you can give." He let that land. "And if he somehow forces it through a side channel, every limited partner has standing to sue the GP personally for unauthorized deployment of committed capital. That's not a slap. That's clawback territory. That's the kind of thing that ends a man's career in this industry permanently." I closed my eyes. I could see the whole sequence already, the way I'd seen the Corvea thesis 18 months ago, not as a hope, but as a structure already standing, waiting for someone to walk into it. "I'm not going to force anything," I said. "I'm not even going to refuse consent. I'm just not going to give it. There's a difference." "There's a profound difference," Henrik agreed. "Silence isn't sabotage. It's the absence of a key. You don't have to break the door. You just have to not unlock it." I thanked him. Before I hung up, he said one more thing, quietly, the way you say the true thing at the end of a call. "You know he's going to find out tomorrow or Thursday," he said. "The custodian will flag it before the wire. He'll come looking for you. He'll need that signature, and he'll realize the only person who can give it is the woman he called a scout." A beat. "What do you want me to do when he calls me?" I looked out at the bridge, at the long string of lights crossing the dark water, steady and unbothered. Tell him the truth, I said. Tell him it's all in Section 7-4. And tell him I've had it since before he could find this building on a map. I hung up. The next morning, I came in at my usual 6:40. I checked the wire queue the way I always did. And there it was. Corvea Systems, $214 million. Status, pending authorization, hold flag, major deployment consent, Section 7.4. Required signatory, chair, investment committee. $214 million, sitting perfectly still, waiting for a signature that wasn't coming. At 9:12, 3 floors up, I heard the first raised voice. The custodian bank flagged the wire at 9:08. By 9:12, Sebastian Voss was standing in the doorway of my office without knocking, and for the first time since he'd arrived, his easy warmth was gone. "There's a hold on the Corvea wire," he said. No greeting. His tablet was in his hand, knuckles pale around the edge of it. "Compliance is saying it needs a signature. Your signature. Some section. 7-something. He said it like the number was an insult someone had invented to inconvenience him personally. "What is this, Sasha?" I didn't get up. I'd learned that too. That the person who stays seated while the other person stands in the doorway has already won the geometry of the room. "Section 7-4, I said. "Major deployment consent." "I don't care what it's called. Sign it. We close today." "I'm not going to do that." He came in then, set the tablet on my desk, planted both hands on the wood, and leaned. "You don't have the authority to hold up a deal I own." "I don't own the deal," I agreed. "You took it. But the deal isn't the question. The wire is. And any single deployment of committed capital over $150 million requires the written consent of the chair of the investment committee." I let the silence do a little work. "I'm the chair of the investment committee." I watched it move across his face, the slow arrival of a thing he should have checked 12 days ago. "We changed that," he said, but it came out less certain than he wanted. "The reorg. Your stewardship now. Honorary." "You reassigned a portfolio," I said. "You can do that. You cannot reassign the chairmanship. That takes a unanimous LP resolution, and you don't have one. You left me the title because you thought it was a nameplate." I let myself say the next part very plainly. It's not a nameplate. It's a break. And it's mine. By 9:40, the vault was full. He'd called an emergency session to override me. That was the plan I could read on his face. The certainty that this was procedural, that he'd gather the committee and the general counsel and steamroll the obstacle. 12 of us around the obsidian table again. A daze at the far end with a binder I recognized. Henrik dialing in on the screen, a small calm rectangle of a man in a study lined with books. Sebastian stood at the head of the table and laid it out as a formality. "We have a closing today," he said. "There's an administrative hold flag to an old consent provision. I'm asking the committee to authorize a deployment the fund has already approved. Sasha is choosing to obstruct it. I'd like a vote to override." "There's no vote that overrides it," Adaze said quietly, before anyone could raise a hand. The room turned to her. She opened the binder to a tabbed page. "Section 7-4 is not subject to committee override," she said, in the flat, careful voice of someone who has read a document more recently than everyone else in the room combined. "The consent right is personal to the office of the chair. It cannot be delegated, assigned, or overridden by the general partner or by any successor governance body. The only mechanism that supersedes it is a unanimous written resolution of all limited partners." She looked up. "We don't have one. We can't get one by end of day. The wire requires Sasha's signature. There is no other path." On the screen, Henrik's voice came through, dry and final. "I drafted that clause," he said. "It does exactly what it says." If the wire is forced through any side channel without the chair's consent, every limited partner has personal standing against the GP unauthorized deployment of committed capital. I'd advise the firm, and Mr. Voss personally, that this is clawback and liability territory. I would not recommend testing it. The temperature of the room changed. I watched it happen in the faces around the table. The same recalculation Olin had made in the kitchen, the same arithmetic, running now in reverse. Dev, who'd laughed twice, was studying the obsidian like it might open. Two of the principals had shifted their chairs a fraction of an inch, the way people do when they want it understood they were never really on the side that was about to lose. Sebastian's voice, when it came, had dropped its podium polish. "Sasha." He tried for reasonable. "Let's be adults. The deal is good. You said so yourself. The founder is waiting. We're going to look insane to Corvea if we miss the close over AI, a paperwork ghost from a decade ago." He spread his hands. "Sign it, and I'll make sure your role is restored. Co-lead on Corvea. Your name on it. Whatever you want." There it was. The bargain. Whatever you want. The currency of a man who has just understood, in front of witnesses, that he needs the person he humiliated. "On Monday I was a scout," I said. "On Tuesday you took me off the data room. On Wednesday you told 12 people the fund needs killers, not people like me." I kept my voice level, because the calm is the whole point. "And today you need my signature to move $214 million. So I want you to understand that I'm not refusing out of spite. I want this deal to close. I sourced it. I believe in it more than anyone in this room." A flicker of hope crossed his face. "But it's not going to close under you," I said, "because you've just demonstrated to everyone here exactly the kind of judgment 7-4 exists to stop. You tried to wire $250 million without confirming who was authorized to send it. That's not velocity. That's the thing I built the break for." I looked around the table at the witnesses, at the partners I'd hired, at the deal that was mine. "I'll authorize the Corvea wire. Today, on time. The founder will not lose a minute." I turned back to Sebastian. "On one condition. The deal closes under the chair's authority, mine, and the GP office is recused from it entirely, in writing, per 7-4. You don't touch Corvea. You don't take credit for Corvea. The reorg memo that pulled it into your column is rescinded as void, because a portfolio transfer can't carry a consent right that's personal to the chair." I slid a single sheet across the obsidian, the document Adaiz had drawn up an hour earlier. "Sign that, and I'll sign the wire. Refuse, and the wire sits frozen until the LPs convene, which means the close slips, the founder asks why, and the limited partners ask their outside counsel why a 12-day GP tried to move a fund's largest check ever without reading the operating agreement." I let it rest. "I don't think you want them asking Henrik that question." The room was silent. On the screen, Henrik said nothing, which was its own kind of testimony. Sebastian looked at the sheet. He looked at Adaize, who looked back without expression. He looked at the screen, where his own firm's outside counsel sat waiting. And finally he looked at me, and I watched the last of it leave his face, the certainty, the warmth, the book deal, the podcast, the whole architecture of a man who had concluded he could not be wrong. He picked up the pen. The Corvea wire released at 2:41 that afternoon, under my signature, exactly as I'd promised. Tomas Rinne never knew there'd been a problem. He got the confirmation, sent me a 3-word message, "Thank you, Sasha," and went back to building the company I'd flown 3,000 miles to back. The deal closed clean. It remains, to this day, the best check Aldermont has ever written. Sebastian's recusal held because Henrik made sure it was airtight. The rescinded reorg memo went out the next morning to the same distribution list that had received the original, only this time the passive voice worked in my favor. The prior realignment is withdrawn, effective immediately. No explanation. The whole floor understood it anyway. That's the thing about administrative cruelty. The same quiet that hides a knife can broadcast a verdict. He lasted 9 more weeks. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody escorted him out. The limited partners had a quarterly call, and somewhere in that call someone asked a question about deployment controls and governance, and outside counsel answered it factually, and the answer included the phrase, attempted to initiate the fund's largest deployment without confirming authorization under the operating agreement. You don't survive that sentence in a room of people whose money you nearly moved without permission. The book and the podcast didn't help him. They'd made him a brand, and a brand is just a larger surface for a crack to spread across. He resigned to pursue opportunities better aligned with his thesis. We all wrote him polite notes. I wrote mine in 2 sentences. As for me, I didn't take the corner office. They offered it the way they always offer the throne to the person who turns out to have been holding the keys the whole time. The committee asked me to step into the GP role, full authority, public profile, the works. I said no. I stayed exactly where I was. Chair of the investment committee, custodian of the break, the second person on the floor every morning after the cleaning crew. I asked for one thing instead, that Section 7.4 be strengthened, not weakened, and extended down to a lower threshold so that the next time a confident newcomer mistook velocity for judgment, the structure would catch it earlier. The LPs ratified it unanimously. They'd just watched it save them $250 million. Olin started making eye contact in the kitchen again. I never made him apologize for the weeks he hadn't. The math he'd run was the same math I'd run at his age, and I wasn't going to punish a young analyst for understanding the building he worked in. I did eventually promote him. People ask me, when this story comes up at dinners, whether I felt vindicated, whether the moment Sebastian picked up that pen was the moment I'd been waiting 11 years for. It wasn't. The moment I'd been waiting for happened a long time before that, when I was 28 and terrified and certain I was about to be fired for refusing to sign a document until it had a break in it. Everyone in that room thought I was being difficult. I was being difficult. That's the part nobody tells you, that the protection you'll need most is the one you have to fight for when you have the least power to fight, before you can possibly explain why it matters, when the only thing you have to go on is the cold conviction that someday someone overconfident will reach for a number too large, and you'll want to be the one standing between them and the wire. I didn't win because I was clever in a boardroom. I won because 11 years earlier, I read past the part everyone else skips. They built me a title and assumed it was decorative. They never read the page that said it was a break.